Hello, everyone, and welcome to the live stream. My name is Harshil, and I'll be learning with you how to use JavaScript in n8n. Joining in today with me is Ivan. Ivan works with me at n8n, and you might have also seen him answer your questions on the community forum and help you build your workflows. So let's get Ivan on the stream. Hi, Ivan. How are you doing?
Hi, Harshil. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining me. Awesome. So, Ivan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Right. Basically, I'm a full stack developer here at n8n. Like you, I'm also currently based here in Germany. And I'd say like my technical responsibilities at n8n, like they span all across the code base. Like I've done integrations like TransferWise, Reddit, Bitwarden, QuickBooks, like, lost count, and some other like kind of comprehensive features like error handling, workflow tagging, some backend work, the open API to n8n converter, and so on, and some fixes and touch-ups on the main website, documentation website. So yeah, that's a bit about me.
Wow, awesome. So I think we got an expert with us on this topic. So anyone, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat, and we'll ask Ivan all those questions and try to get it on for you. All right. So Ivan, I have a first question for you. So there is n8n has a special kind of a data structure, right? So can you spread some light on it and explain us how it looks like and how n8n processes the data?
Right. Well, I mean, from the point of view of I don't know, like a beginner, someone who hasn't really like worked a lot with n8n, basically what you see is just a bunch of nodes linked together into a workflow, and you don't see any looping, you don't see sort of the data going through. You might see it when you sort of run the workflow manually, but you're not really sure sort of how is the information, the data traveling from one node kind of to the other? How is it actually sent? So kind of the first thing that we need to remember is that the top level of the bundle that travels from one node to the other is in n8n is basically called items, and is this array. It's always sort of a wrapper that needs to be an array, which is a list of items. In fact, for example, if you were to try to mock some data and in a function node, for example, and you forget to wrap it inside of an array, the first thing that you're going to see is some validation saying that you forcefully need to return an array from that node. So first thing to remember, everything that like is conveyed from one node to another is always an array. Now, inside of this array or a list, if you want to call it that, what we have are the items themselves. It could be one item array, it could be a many item array. And these items have a kind of like a very particular structure. Like if you're a bit like familiar with JavaScript, you might think that this would be just like a simple object containing an arbitrary structure. But in n8n, I mean, we need to deal with both JSON data as well as binary data.
Okay.
So, I mean, we kind of need to enforce that within the structure of the item itself, which means that, very simply, each of the items will have either a property called JSON or a property called binary. Now, going even like deeper down, inside of this JSON property is where we actually sort of are at full liberty to set any of the keys and values that we like, as long as they conform to a kind of a standard JavaScript object. In a way, it would be kind of good to clarify here to sort of emphasize that the JSON property in each item actually points to a JavaScript object, not to JSON itself. I mean, if we're very strict about it, JSON is a format for exchanging data over the wire, over a network connection. JSON is just a string, which is very specific sort of set of restrictions and constraints that do not apply to a JavaScript object, which is the value of the JSON property that the JSON property is pointing at. So I know this might be kind of like slightly confusing at first. So obviously let me know if anything is not clear, but the important thing to know is that whenever you see the JSON property, that's where you can only have a JS object as the value of that. And then kind of the other side of the coin, the other major property that we have is the binary property. Of course, my advice would be, if you're just starting out with n8n or just coding in general, I would say not to worry too much about binary data in the beginning. I guess like what you need to know at first basically is that we at n8n, we encode binary data into a string, using base 64, which kind of
Okay.
for practical purposes means that, let's say, I don't know, like you have a PDF file, you have an image file, you have an audio file. What we do is n8n encapsulates this binary data into a base 64 encoded string, and we end up storing it in the binary property of each item. Again, not the JSON property, but the binary property. Interestingly,
Okay.
I mean, if you think about it, like base 64 actually encodes each set of 3 bytes into 4 bytes. It's like a 33% large, 33% increase, which means that if you have like a base 64 encoded version of an input, it will be 33% larger, which means that, I mean, this is one of the reasons that you need to be careful when you're working with large binary data, because it just
Right.
grows
Right.
over the size of your original input. I hope
All right.
that's
Okay.
kind of
I'm
clear.
gonna take a pause over here because we have a lot of messages coming in. Hey D Archdrake. I'm sorry, I don't know how do you pronounce your name, but hey, thank you for joining in. I see a question from him. It says, how much knowledge of JS is needed with n8n? So do you need to be an expert with JavaScript, or just a few? I don't know. If you're just a beginner with JavaScript, would that be enough?
So I'm a bit biased because I come like my favorite node is the function node. So like I lean towards like fixing things with code. But on the other hand, I mean the whole point of the tool is to enable people to code as little as possible. I mean, usually when you might find that you need JS is when you're doing something kind of very custom that we might not have predicted, and that is usually sort of a 3-line piece of code can fix. And in fact, you can sort of go to the forums and we can fix it very quickly. So it's good if you have some sort of basis for, I mean, some base JS knowledge, but it's not gonna like stop you in your tracks. And even if in the rare case where it does, I mean, you're just one answer away in the forums from like getting unstuck and keep going. I mean, the whole point of this is to enable you to automate stuff, not to help, I mean, not to lead you to learn coding, but it would be a nice side effect if you can get it.
All right. And I would also like to point out that we have this documentation where we have shared all the JavaScript code snippets that people often use in the function node. So you can just go to this link and try out the code snippets from them. You might have to customize it based on your output, but then it contains almost everything that you might need. Awesome. Moving forward, I see another question. What are the side limits on the binary data?
To be honest, I wouldn't be able to tell you. I mean, that's probably something that we would need to ask Jan. But as I said before, I mean, n8n is not optimized for very heavy workloads like this. So it's definitely something that you should keep in mind and probably find. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it's already specified in documentation. Myself, I haven't worked with binary data too much, so I haven't tested the limits to be able to give you a concrete answer.
Awesome. I see another message. It says the page is lifesaver. Yes. I often happen to use this documentation over and over, and just find out the code snippets, change the few parameters, and then use it in my workflows. All right. Now I'm gonna move forward, and I have a lot of questions when just when you were talking about the JSON, when you're talking about arrays. So I'm just gonna share my screen, and we can look at the diagram and maybe help me understand better. So earlier you shared this image with me. Can you just help me understand the difference, like what is in the top items and what is happening in the bottom items?
Exactly. So as we said, when we're working with n8n, n8n has this bundle that sends from node A to node B. This bundle is what we see for now. Just focus on the top half of the diagram.
Okay.
The top half, we can see the bundle. The bundle is called items, and it's an array. I mean, whatever is in a dashed line, as you can see there, think of it as an array. And in that array, as we said, we have items, right? To keep it simple for now, let's forget about binary data. Let's focus on sort of the most common use case for beginners, which would be the JSON property. So again, a bundle called items, which contains a number of items. Each of those items, or the blue squares, have a property called JSON, which points to the actual data, to the actual object. Remember, this is a JavaScript object, so whatever is legal inside of a JavaScript object is something that you can have in the red squares. This is sort of like, we could call it like the end game for n8n. I mean, you are usually working with sort of like discrete separate units or pieces of data. These pieces of data are wrapped in the blue squares, and sort of the interesting parts are the red bits that you have inside. So it's one bundle with packages that have your data inside of a JSON property. And the other sort of the bottom half would be mostly for reference, so that you might get, for example, you're working with you have a workflow, you have a node, and this node returns information in, we would say, like an array that is not exactly like split up into items recognizable by n8n. You can see it usually, for example, you execute a node, and then on the top left of the display section, you can see items 1, even though you have a ton of different items, you may have a ton of different items. So, I mean, that might be confusing at first, because, I mean, why does it say 1 when you have a ton? And the reason is, I mean, I'm hoping to sort of like make graphic the reason here. It's because you have this, again, bundle of items at the top level. We saw this. And inside of that bundle, what do we have? How many blue squares do we have? It's just one.
Yeah.
Your data is inside of an array inside of that blue square, which means that in the eyes of n8n, it sees as many items as blue squares you have. So basically, if you are in the second situation, in the bottom half situation, what you're very likely to want to do is to split up that data, which we're going to probably see later on, and take it to the end game, which is the top half. Sort of when you're in the top half, n8n sees as many items as you have, and you can do as many operations as you want on those. And the second half is sort of to show you why maybe your operations are not like affecting each item, and that is because of the bundling that you have, and that you need to reformat so that it's so you can work on each item by itself.
Got it. And we got another question. Could you showcase that inside n8n? Yes, we have a few example workflows for you that we are gonna showcase in n8n. But before jumping into that, so Ivan, does that mean that if I'm using, let's just say, the items which have individual objects as shown in the first image, like, do I have to then do some kind of looping or something so that n8n processes all the individual items, or does n8n handle it by default?
So this is very interesting. Most sort of newcomers to n8n kind of, and it is totally understandable, they don't realize that the looping mechanism is intrinsic to the workflow process execution. Basically, let's say you have a workflow with 3 nodes, and the first node, I don't know, makes a call to some third-party service and retrieves 3 items, only 3 items. Those 3 items are, again, wrapped in this items array and sent from node 1 to node 2. Node 2, let's say it has a particular operation. How many times will that operation happen? As many times as you have items on your array. So you have 3 items, you're applying that operation 3 times. Then you get to node C. Again, you have 3 items, you get 3 operations. Like to abstract it away, it would be n items, n operations. I mean, this is precisely the reason why we don't need a loop node. I mean, if you think about it, it's not there in the node panel selection, and it's because everything that happens inside of n8n happens to all of the items in the array. The looping construct is implicit in a way that's sort of, well, the way of a node code tool, like to abstract away the looping mechanism so that you only need to think about sort of what should happen to your items, and the iteration, the process of doing something to each of those will happen by default.
Got it. Okay, awesome. What I'm thinking is let's start, with the workflows and start with some code over here so that we get a better visual idea. Awesome. So let me give a brief of what we are going to do in this particular workflow. So I already created some mock data that we are going to use. And Ivan, can you just explain the structure over here first?
Exactly. Maybe you can click on it so it's even larger and people can see it a bit better. Okay. Yeah, perfect. So, I mean, what is mock data? Basically, I mean, in a normal scenario, you just fetch your data from a third-party service and it's like meaningful data. Here, we're just using the function node to create or to artificially create 3 items with, as we said before, each item has a JSON property, and inside of that JSON property, you can have anything that you want. It's very likely that all of the items are going to have sort of the same structure, even if they may have like different information. For example, the IDs are different, the names are different, but the ID and the name properties are the same in this particular instance. And again, remember the diagram. You have an array, remember the orange sort of top level bundle.
Yeah, okay. So
which is represented, exactly. That orange bundle is represented by those square brackets at the very beginning and the very end. Then if you remember the diagram, you have blue squares with a JSON property. Again, you have 3.
Would be a JSON, the blue box basically?
Exactly. You're selecting them with the same color. So basically, what you have there are those 3 sort of items with always with a JSON property. And inside of the JSON property, as you can see there, you have an object in red, which means that you can have anything that you want inside of there. I mean, you have to remember, for example, it's often the case that the structure is going to be very similar, but there's nothing stopping you. For example, if you want to add a third property like place Berlin to the first item, it's not going to fail. It's going to be, it wouldn't be sort of, it wouldn't be very representative of a normal use case, because usually sort of your items are uniform in that sense. But this is, again, to convey the point that whatever you have, you can have any object that you want inside of the JSON, inside of the value that is being referenced by the JSON property.
Okay, I see a message from Chris. Chris says, thanks for the excellent explanation so far. Yes, thanks, Ivan. It's making a lot of sense right now, and thank you for the amazing explanation. I have got another question. So can this object have another object within it?
So this is very interesting. You can have as many levels of nesting as you want. For example, let's say instead of city, you can put in address.
Okay.
And instead of Berlin, you open and close square brackets.
Okay, square brackets.
Sorry, curly braces.
Okay.
And inside of those curly braces, you can have city, Berlin, street, I don't know, the Linden, number, something else. So you can keep adding and adding as many levels of nesting as you like, because there's no hard limit and levels of nesting.
All right. So you are saying that this should work, and we can have objects within an object. So now the next question is, can we have an array within an object? So in this particular JSON, can we have an array as well?
You're saying an error?
Array.
Sorry, an array. Yeah, totally. I mean, you have to remember, I mean, if you look at, for example, Mozilla Developer Network and look for JavaScript object, everything that is legal there is legal here. So you can have any value. I mean, you can have null, you can, in fact, it's very likely that you're going to, like, whatever you want to add is going to be feasible, because, I mean, this is, again, if you think about it, JSON, the JSON sort of standard for data interchange between even different programming languages, was actually based on the JS object. So, I mean, this is even more, the scope of what is allowed here is even larger than what you might get otherwise. So yeah, there are, of course, restrictions, but for most use cases, you're probably going to find that what you want to represent, the data you want to represent in that item, it's going to be very likely that it's possible.
Okay, awesome. Folks, if you have any questions till now what we have covered, feel free to ask us in the chat. We are gonna move forward, but we'll come back to your questions. So now I'm gonna execute the node just to see what it returns. Awesome. So we got 3 values over here, 3 items, I should say. And because we only set address for the very first item, we have the address only for the first one. This is interesting. Awesome. So as you mentioned earlier, that if I just set some properties, or if I manipulate just one item, it should manipulate all the items down the line, right?
Exactly. I mean, in this case, we're just generating the data itself. We're not doing much more than just giving birth to the origin of what is going to be processed by the later stages of the workflow.
All right. I see Chris has send us a message that says the set node is also super useful to build the data structure required by APIV. Yes, and this gives me an idea. So what I'm gonna do is to see if the items, to see if Ivan is lying or not. I'm gonna use the set node and see, if it iterates through all these items or not. Select the set node. Okay, I'm gonna toggle keep only set to true. So what this does is it will only return the information that we are configuring in this particular node. And since we are gonna play around with strings, I'm just gonna select string. I'm gonna call it a message. So current node input data JSON. So I am only seeing one item over here, but I can select this item and it would work for all the items.
Exactly. It's important to notice here, I mean, the one and the name, they're actually being displayed as just the first one so that you sort of recall what the property is about, but what you're actually selecting there is the property itself, not the name.
Got it. Okay. So let me just make a message here. Hello, Tim. Your ID is one. Now this would create the same message for all my items. That's what I learned so far. So I'm just gonna execute it. Awesome. Okay. So I didn't have to use any kind of looping. I just got the data in my set node. I structured the data only for one item and it processed the data for all the items. Awesome. I see how it works and now I can understand how it is, how I can move forward with this. I see a question over here. It's when would you use the set node versus the function node for changing data structure? That's a good one.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So basically, it depends on the complexity of what you want to achieve. For example, in this particular case, let's say you have 3 items and you want to add, well, what are we doing here? Adding a key value pair to each of those items. Those key value pairs, I mean, at least in the simple example, are just getting added at the top level of the object, right? But what if you want to do some more complex manipulation? What if you want to extract some bit of information from your data structure, create an entirely different data structure with levels of nesting and return it back? In that case, I would probably prefer the function node. If you think about it, even like everything you do with a set node, you can also do it with a function node. I mean, it would be very simple, just whatever item you get, just add dot my variable equals your value, and that is going to be added to all of the items themselves. I would say if you're starting out, like work with the set node, and once you start hitting the limits of what's comfortable to do in the set node, then you might start thinking about and reach for the add node. Awesome.
Cool. Yeah, maybe we will try out the set node and see where we hit the limitations in the next upcoming workflows.
Sounds good.
So what I'm gonna do next is I'm gonna send it to my test Discord server and see how it works. So okay, I have to select the text. I always forget this. All right. So again, because n8n handles the looping for me, it would send me 3 different messages with 3 different content. So if I execute this, okay, I get 3 success messages, and if I come over here and I get 3 different messages. So this is awesome. So Ivan, do you want to do a quick recap of what we did in this workflow?
Yeah, basically what we did is create, I mean, this is a good thing. When you're starting out, like creating your workflow, it might always be useful to start with a function node and mock the data that you're going to get so that you don't make calls all the time and you can test more efficiently. So you generate 3 items with the structure that sort of you're hoping to get from the actual call later down the line. You use set to, in this case, we're using the setting called keep only set. So we're setting the key value pair, which is a message, and the value, which is based on the properties of the items that are coming in. And the reason that you're only seeing message and not, for example, the name, ID, is because the setting keep only set has been enabled. And again, set is running 1 time per item. So 3 times in total. So you can even see there items 3. And at the last node in the workflow, basically, again, you're doing 3 operations, which are 3 calls to the webhook URL that you set for your test server. And you're basically just sending those 3, sending 3 times, as many times as items that you have. So 3 calls to send your 3 messages as separate messages. You have to remember, like, what arrives at your test server are 3 separate messages, not 1.
Got it. Understood. Thank you. I see a question from Pavel. When would you use function node versus function item node? That's a good question. Do you want to take it right now, or do you want to move to the next workflow and show it in action over there?
Do you think it would be more clear in the next one, or we can do it here? I mean, whichever you prefer.
Let's do it here.
Okay, so let's add, I mean, if you like, maybe you can add a function item node.
Oh, my bad.
Exactly. And what you get, you have to remember, we have 3 items that are traveling from one node to the next. Maybe to make it, like, to simplify this, maybe you can pause the set and the Discord node and just connect mock data to function item directly.
Yeah, okay.
So that people don't get confused by the stuff that's happening in the middle.
Yeah, makes sense.
And what you do there is you have to remember, we had the function node, which just runs once and provides, like, whatever result you need from the items that you get. There's a difference. The function node receives the bundle of items, the orange array of items, right? That's
right.
Sort of what you can access when you just type items dot something else. In the function item node, if you go back, you can see it there, even in the example. It says item, it's a singular. So
right. Okay.
The sort of the scope of access there is the item itself. I mean, there are two different ways of doing the same thing. The only difference is that here you're only operating on a single item. In this case, for example, if you execute the node, each of the items that you generated with the mock data is going to get the my variable equals to 1. As you can see, it has been added to each of those. When, by contrast, if you were to use the function node, the regular function node, you would have access to the items array, which is the entire array, which means that you would have to map over it or loop over it to basically iterate over the array in order to access each item and do whatever you want with those items. Maybe, I mean, different people think differently, right? I mean, I'm more of the opinion that it's easier to start with the function node, but the function item node, as you can see, it's very sort of terse, very compact. So if you have in your head what it is that you want to do to a particular item, that's all you, I mean, everything that you're specifying in the code, sort of in the input field of the function item node, is simply everything that you're doing to each particular item. So it depends. There are different perspectives to achieve the same thing. So I would say, when would you use one versus the other? I would say it's a matter of choice and what you're more comfortable with. I would say using the function node sort of gives you more flexibility in that you have the array and you can do different things to each item. In this case, you're doing the same thing to each item. So in a way, I mean, they're not exactly the same, but as with many things, I mean, it comes down to practice and seeing sort of when you have your solution, where does it look more elegant, more compact, more like smaller, and even more readable.
Right. Okay. So we got another question on this. So you don't need to loop over things in the function item node.
Exactly. So as you can look at the code. So you say item.myVariable equals 1. How many items are being affected by that line? All of them. Each of them.
Yeah.
So the looping mechanism is implicit in the function item node. Hence the function item, sort of the item part of the name of the node. Basically, you could have a loop over an array in the function node, or you can have an action over an item in the function item node. Maybe that makes it a bit clearer.
Got it. Okay. So this is what I have learned about the function item node till now, is that if you know what you want to do for if you know what you want to do for your items, and if everything is gonna be if everything is gonna remain the same for all the items. For example, if we just want to add a new variable to our object, or maybe just delete an item from that particular object, right? That's when we use the function item node, because we want that operation to be performed in all those items. But if you want to have, like, let's just say a bit more flexibility, and if you want to have some kind of, I don't know, a condition where I want to check if this is something doing, if it's doing something very particular, only then add this variable. If it's doing something more particular, do this, something like that, and that's when you use the function node.
Exactly. I mean, even if what you're showing there is just the set node.
Right.
I mean, if you think about it, if you like the set node, for example, you might think that maybe the function item is very similar. So, I mean, it's a different way of arriving also at the function node. I mean, what you're doing there is exactly the same. You're defining one operation that is going to happen for each item in your bundle that is traveling along.
We got a message from Chris. You save the looping over the items for a bit more easier code. Yeah, that's what I think the function item node does, right?
Yeah, I mean, the looping is happening anyway. It's just implicit, and so you don't have to look at it in a way. So you can focus on the important part, which is not really the looping that we know will happen, but what's the actual action that we want to happen as many times as we have items.
Got it. And we got Oma saying, I would say it's better to use regular function node instead of function item when you need access to multiple rows from the input. Yep. For situations when you are doing a reduce operation, for example. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah.
Thank you, Omar.
Thank you, Omaya. But the message from Chris made me think, like I have been using the function node a lot to perform the similar operations on all the items, but it would make more sense if I'm you doing just one particular operation on all the items to use a function item node.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
agreed.
All right.
Same thing, different words.
Yeah. All right. So I am gonna move on to the next one, and in this one we are gonna look into the single items that we have been talking about. So earlier we just saw a response which contained multiple items. Now we're gonna see a response which contains a single item. So coming back to this image, we saw the first half of the image where we had different objects. Now we are just gonna look at this particular part of the image where we will have just one particular JSON item. So over here, I am using a API, a mock API again. That's a JSON placeholder API, which would give me some posts from that API. So I'm just gonna make a request to this, and I got a response over here. Okay, so Ivan, aren't these individual items in itself? Because they look like an individual item to me.
So yes and no. I mean, if you can switch to the JSON view, which might kind of reveal a bit more of what is going on. One important thing to remember is, we have been showing these diagrams, we have been talking about the Json property, and I mean, someone who's very awake right now might be able to say, where is the Json property here? I mean, right. It's not visibly there. This is something that I would agree with. It's not there, but believe me, it is there. This is sort of a presentation screen, you could say. I mean, you could even say this is, okay, you clicked on the JSON view, so it's implied. If you want to be very strict about it or very explicit about it, think of it as the JSON property still being there, right? Yeah. So what do we have here? As you can see there, look at the first sort of look even on the top left of the display section, you have items 1, right? So that might tip you off that even if you have, as you can see, like you look at it very quickly, you'd say, okay, I have a lot of items. Why is it looking? What does it look like I have 1? What does n8n think that I have 1? Mm-hmm. Well, the issue here is that you have this third-party service that's receiving your call and is returning some data to you. This third-party service, well, basically these items don't mean anything, but think of it as users, as posts, or whatever you like discrete units of data. these come packaged again in an array. So the third-party service grabs all the items, puts them in an array, and gives that array to you. What happens here? N8n also, as we said, had this orange items array, right? So we have one wrapper for n8n, one wrapper by the third-party service, which like, they have like 100 users. They package them in an array and give them to you. So n8n receives it. You have an array from n8n, an array from the third-party service, and then you have all your items. So n8n, what is n8n seeing here? It's basically seeing one item that's represented by this bundle, right?
Okay.
So I'm a user. I say, okay, I don't care about the structure itself. I just want to operate on my items. How do I do this? I mean, how do I unbundle the bundle itself so that I can gain access to the items, so that instead of saying items 1, I can see items 100, and I know that whatever I do is going to happen 100 times to each of those users, right?
Right.
I guess that's where you're going, right?
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So I'm just gonna try something over here. I just want to see if it works or not. So I'm gonna use a set node, and what I want to do is I want to get all these individual items. So let's try it out. Do you think it's gonna work?
Do you want me to ruin the surprise?
Let's not do that. What should we call it? Let's call it post. Add expression, current node, input data. Choose. Okay.
So what is your intent here?
So my intent here was to get the item, right? Do something with that so that it happens with all the items. So maybe, I don't know, get the title, have something like, title, and then get the title. But now if I'm looking at the structure over here, right? So I have a title for the very first post. That goes, that's fine. But would this work for the title for the next post?
So I see you're not worried that we have items 1 when we actually have 100. So you're just like, let's ignore it for now.
Yeah. What I want to see is if I get this data, right? If I structure this data, would it work for all my items or would it not? Okay,
So
let's try it out.
Okay.
Just want to try it out. Interesting. Okay. So it just worked for only the first title. Can you help me understand what's happening over here?
So you have to remember, we have an array that has 100 items.
Right.
What does the set node do? The set node sets a key value pair on an object, right? So you cannot set, or well, JavaScript is funny like that, but you shouldn't set a key value pair on an array, right? I mean, you can access array at length and use it, but for most like reasonable use cases, you would not do it, right? So here you activate it again, keep only set, and you're setting a post property to an object, to the object that is being affected by the set node, which again, remember, n8n is saying 1. And again, as you have keep only set, everything else falls away. So basically you're ruining everything by acting as if you have 100 items when you actually have a bundle of 100 items. You need to unbundle them first and operate on each of these items once they're outside of that.
Got it. So how do we do that?
How do we do that? Okay, if you prefer, I mean, I would say, preferred version would be, sort of the more explicit version would be working with a function node here.
Let's do that.
So that we can even show different variants of how to solve this.
Let's do that. Since the live stream is called using JavaScript in n8n, right? Let's do it. Okay, so I have the function node. So
right.
Yeah.
So what do we want to achieve? We have a bundle, and we want to have a bundle of 100 items, and we choose 100 items. We want to open the wrapper and throw away the wrapper, right? So I'm going to give you sort of different possibilities, and I mean, you can think about later which one you would prefer. But the first, what comes to mind first would be, remember, you always return what you want the output to be, right? So we have return items. What is items? We said it. It's an array, right? It's an array that has contents that we want, right? So
Right.
you would say items at 0 to grab at those contents, right? So right now we have like sort of the contents of that array. What is the contents of that array? An object with a JSON property, we saw this, that points to an array of the items that we want, right?
Right.
So we would say .json. Maybe it would be even clearer if we go back to the diagram.
Okay. Yeah.
So we have it's the same name. We have items, which is this
Yeah.
orange structure, and we say items at 0, it's equal to the blue rectangle.
Okay.
Blue.
Got it.
We want to sort of like keep drilling down into the structure. So what do we say? .json to access the value that is being pointed at by the JSON property. So at that point, we have arrived at the red array, you would call it, which is the container of all those items, right?
Right. Right.
So if you go back now.
Okay. Wrong workflow. Yeah.
Exactly. So basically, this is equal to the red array that we're pointing at. Now, what do we want to do with that array? We want to act on each of those items and return an n8n compliant item, right?
Right. Right.
So one solution, I'm going to give you a different one after this, but like the shortest and sweetest version, I think would be .map. If you're not used to it, map is a kind of a funny word to say like do something to each of those items and return back an array. And inside the map, I think these were users, right? So it would say like, oh yeah, item works as well. Item, fat arrow, exactly. And then what do we want to return? What do we want each item to look like? Can it be just my item? We know that n8n, as we said, requires either a JSON property or a binary property as sort of the top level property of the item. So again, we have an object. Curl. Oh, you can do it on the same line.
Okay, cool.
And inside of that object, you have JSON.
Let's do it in a more structured way. Like, sorry, but I really like to be more structured.
It's fine. Like different people had different like ways of writing, and that it doesn't need to be an object again. You can just pass in the item, and likely, yeah. I mean, I don't know if you're going to need curly braces after the fat arrow function, or if it's probably gonna work that way. And try it out and see if it works.
Okay, let's do this.
Okay. The new line, the new line is not gonna like it. So basically, what you have is item. Yeah, I think you probably need to return it in. Can I post here? Yeah, with what's it called? Like the round braces. So item, fat arrow function.
And then parentheses. I don't know. I'm talking about this.
So it would be item. If you can, maybe you can do it my way. If you go to the first line, at the very end of the first line, you would say open round braces, open curly braces inside of there. Yep. JSON.
And then item.
Colon item, exactly. And then close it with a semicolon and delete the rest.
Got it. Okay. Okay.
And so what happened here, right? So you have a bundle. You reached out inside of the bundle. You had this object, this n8n generated object that has most likely will have a JSON property. You access that and you get access to your actual array of items. And then remember it has map, but think of it as iterating over each of the items there. And what do you do with those items? You convert them, you translate them into an n8n compliant format, which, as we said, is nothing more than simply an object with JSON and whatever you need inside. Whatever you need is, as you can see here, the original structure that we had. And as you can see on the top left of the display section, n8n is reporting 25 or 100 items, which is exactly what we expected to see.
Interesting. So, okay. So now if I want to process all the items together, right? Let's just say now I want to process and I want to get the titles. So this should work for all the 100 titles now.
It should work, exactly.
Okay, awesome. This is good. Okay, so what did we learn? What did we learn? So we learned,
So, go ahead.
you can correct me if I'm wrong. So we learned that n8n, so whenever we make a call to an external API, sometimes we might get just a single bundle of item, which would contain all the information or all the data. Now to process it in n8n, we need to extract that data and have a separate items for them. So we used a function node to do that. So one of the ways to do that is use the dot map function. And then what it does is it basically will extract all those individual items that we can then use to process, right?
Exactly. Basically, what you need to remember is how do I reach inside the bundle and how do I generate an n8n compliant item? If you can do that, then you can translate like whatever arbitrary structure from a third-party service you have into something that can be processed by every of the 200 nodes in n8n.
Okay, this is interesting. Awesome. We got Justin joining us. Hey, Justin, how are you doing? Cool. So you also mentioned Ivan that there is another way to do this. So can you just
Right.
can you just walk us through that?
So a different sort of, I mean, if you're starting out with programming, you might be more used to a for loop, for example.
Yeah.
So if you want, for example, you can comment out line 1 and you could do it like, I don't know, more explicitly. Well, we like to think that we're abstracting away the looping mechanism, but you can also like make it very explicit so that people can see. I would say, for example, I don't know, like const results equals an empty array. What is this? Well, we're going to be populating and then returning back. Then we would loop over the items that we get. Remember, results is the output. Now we're going to be operating on the input and translating it to the format that needs to be outputted. So we would say for round bracket const item.
You want to do const item? Okay, let's just do it your way.
Of.
Should it be item to item?
Single item.
Right? Okay. Of.
Yeah, you have to remember when you do for and then you're declaring sort of whatever name that you want, it's an alias for each of the items in the array.
Got it.
And then again, items at 0.json.
Items to 0.json. All right.
You can even see it's sort of the parallelism with the above version. It's the same thing. We have the bundle, we reach inside of it, and we access the property that contains what we want to act on. And then we iterate over that sort of resulting nested array, that resulting array, and we have that item. What do we do with that item? Results the push item.
And this should be an object, right?
No, this is an item itself. Oh, sorry. I mean, you're right. It should be. You're totally right. It should be an object with JSON and an item.
All right, and then we
return
results.
And we have the same result. I think it's always useful to see, I mean, sort of the differences and similarities of what we're doing in both versions, because you can use, and there are many other ways to do this as well, but as long as you remember what is coming in and what should come out, you're probably going to get to the right answer. Again, what is coming in? Items. What are we doing with those brackets at .json, which is grabbing inside of that input to what we actually want from that input. And then what are we putting out? Basically, it's an array of items that have a JSON property with whatever we need inside of it. So as long as you focus what is coming in, what is coming out, how you loop over them, it's up to you. There are different ways to achieve the same result.
Gotcha. Awesome. I'm going to take a couple of questions from the chat. So Chris asks, so I don't need a split in batches node to set bundles of items to another API. I use the split in batches node to create loops, but it looks like that I don't need that.
I would feel more comfortable answering that, like looking at the actual workflow and see how that is working. I mean, the split in batches node, I think, like fulfills kind of different responsibilities, which we might not want to sort of like confuse up with that. But yeah, it's a good question, but I would probably not go into it unless we were sort of doing a workflow review kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. But in general, if we have the structure of the incoming data, something like what we created over here, right? So in that case, in the ideal scenario, we won't be needing the split in batches node, right? n8n would be handling it for us.
Exactly. I usually lean towards the simpler solution, the one that has the least amount of code possible. So if you can sort of in the first case would be one line. With one line, you can do away with having more nodes, more arrows pointing, like looping around. If you can abstract away the looping mechanism with little action, I would say that would be usable. But again, whether it's actually doable or not in your particular
Mhm.
workflow, it's on a case by case basis, I would think.
We got another question on that. When does one really use split in batches node? I've never really used it before. I think we already answered this, but Ivan, do you want to just summarize it once again?
To be honest, I would leave that question to you because I would agree with the asker here. I usually don't find myself in situations where I actually really need it, but that
Hmm.
might have been just the use cases that I need to happen to solve.
All right. So one use case that I can think of at the moment is whenever I have conditions and whenever I am using an if node or a switch node. And if I want to check for each particular item for a different condition, sort of a thing. I think it's much more better if I show it, but I don't have a workflow at the moment. But I usually use it in the combination with an if node. So that's when I use a switch node. Okay, so Chris says no worries. Awesome, Chris. Chris, you can also share that particular workflow in the community forum so that we can take a look and get back to you on that. All right. So Ivan, we have a very little time and a few more topics to cover. So let's move forward. So we were talking about nested items earlier, right? So I went ahead, I got another API for you, and that's the Pokemon API. So an interesting thing over here is it would not give you the whole response as we got earlier, and this time the response is gonna be a bit more different. So now you're gonna have to walk me through how do I, get those items from this particular response. Are you up for the challenge?
Let's see what it returns. Hoping it's Pokemon.
Awesome. So I'm just gonna make a call, and okay, so I'm just gonna switch to Jason
Exactly.
over here. All right.
So again, sort of the beginning of the explanation is very similar to what we talked about in the beginning. You're seeing this, but please remember, like everything we talked about, it's still valid, it still applies. This is sort of a view of that.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
again, remember, you have a bundle of items where every item needs to have a JSON property, and that JSON property can have an object of an arbitrary structure within the constraints of JavaScript, right? So again, like if you look at it very quickly and you're not really like paying attention to the details, what do you see? Like you see 5 Pokemon and you see items 1, which again, it's not really lining up with your expectations. And maybe if you sort of recall from the previous example, you might start to see why. There's a difference though. You can see there, remember, the orange bundle of items is the top level sort of square bracket that you see at the very top and the very
Yeah.
bottom.
Okay.
That's the orange bundle of items. You can even see it like it says items 1. Inside
Yeah.
of that, exactly, if you open it up, we have, it's not shown, but it's an object that has a JSON property that
Mm-hmm.
points to that big object. Sort of, as you can see,
Okay. So
the
this
first
whole
curly
object.
brace and the last curly brace are actually the object that is being pointed at by the JSON object. And finally, we arrive at sort of what is actually being returned by the third-party API, which has this particular structure, which, if you haven't seen before, might look kind of unusual, but it's actually very common to see this implementation of pagination for
Mm.
API responses. In this particular case, you can even see it in the URL that we are grabbing an offset of 5 and limiting to 5. And the total, I mean, the count is called usually also it's total. It's, I didn't know we had so many Pokemon, but it's 1,118 total items. There's no previous, so this is page 1. And then finally, we have the results with the items that we wanted to sort of, what we were interested in, right? So again, we have this situation where through no fault of our own, the third-party API is returning something that is not exactly lining up with what n8n would say is counts as an item, right?
Right.
So again, what is the problem? What is the solution? We basically want to grab each item of data, each sort of item that has name and URL, each Pokemon, and convert it and make n8n see each Pokemon by itself, right? So how do we achieve this? So it's a different case, very similar solution with one small twist. This, I mean, if you're interested to know, this is called nesting. And what we want to do is basically just, again, apply the principles that we already learned one step deeper. So again, that's cool. I mean, we always start with the items. The items is this bundle, this array of items that we have. If you remember, I mean, this is a good rule of thumb. If n8n is saying items 1 when you expect more, then it's very likely that you're going to have to do items at 0 because you want to reach inside of that object to keep working on it.
Right.
Again, remember, each item is not discrete, but it has this JSON property, so you always do items at 0.json. And now we have, here's the difference, here's the kick. Before, the information that we wanted was already at this level. Now, as you can see, we have pagination sort of like polluting the data that we want in a way. I mean, if we're not really interested in the pagination properties, the top level properties were count, next, previous, and some others.
Yeah, I can always do that. Yeah.
Count, next, previous, and then the actual results. So what do we do there? Do you remember? JSON is just a property pointing to a value. So again, we have a property pointing to a value, which is the value. So we do dot results. And what does that equal? The actual array with the actual items that we want to work on. And the solution is the exact same. Dot map.
Okay. Item, and then it would return. Let's see if it works. I'm just gonna try it out and see what. Okay, I'm just gonna check once if it's called result or result.
No, you're correct. It's plural.
Right? Okay. All right. Awesome. Okay. So we need to make sure that the whatever item we want to get, we point to that particular item correctly. So in this case, it was results, right? And that's why instead of doing JSON.map, we did JSON.results.map.
Exactly. That's the only difference. Again, think about your input, about how to like put your hand inside of the input to grab hold of what you want to act on, and then simply give n8n what it's expecting. And it's even very easy because I mean we're just like, if you can tell, we're just doing it at once. But if you're trying, you might like get an error, and the errors tend to be very explicit. For example, if you forget to return an array, that's exactly the error message that you're going to see. If you forget to wrap it in a JSON, which we even do, I mean, you have to sort of like keep it in mind. It's always going to tell you. So usually sort of the validation errors for these translation process that we're doing tend to be very explicit in that sense.
All right. I see that there is an excitement among the Pokemon API. That's fun. I recently started playing Pokemon Go, and I really like it. Cool. Taking this forward, the one thing I want to do is, earlier we saw that for every, like if I connect the Discord node and if I send a message, it is gonna send me 5 different messages for each of these. But I don't want to do that. I want to, bundle this all together and send it as a single message. Right. So now let's just assume that we got this as the result from the API. Right. Exactly. So how do I bundle it together and then send a single message on Discord?
Well, basically, you can just use what we already learned. As you know, you're going to have another sort of translation or transformation step in the middle. So again, a function node would be my first choice.
All right.
And then inside, you have to remember what is coming in and what should come out. Now, this is sort of the opposite situation from what we had before. Before we have one, and we want to split it up, reach into it and split it up into 5. Right now we have 5, and we want to sort of create this one, let's say a string per se, just
Right, yeah.
one output format. So what I would say, I mean, sort of one way of solving this would be creating a variable containing the result of concatenating, sort of joining together all the items and then returning that item, right? So let's just scaffold out, let's do the skeleton of that solution, and then we can start filling it in for the viewers. So I would say like const data equals.
All right.
And then before we do the rest of sort of the heart of the solution, then the second line would be return.
But should this be some, like, should I assign it to
Yeah,
something?
I mean, sort of my idea would be, let's do the solution, but from the outside in, sort of the big parts first, and then sort of the consolidation step at the last, which might be sort of the hardest to understand if you're new to this. So I would say, this is where we're going to have sort of this one item of data. Now, before we do this, if you can step into line 2 and say return.
Should I remove this? Or is it
Yes,
okay?
exactly.
Return.
We return, as you know, an array is always mandatory.
All right. Okay. So we are returning an array.
As we know, inside of an array, it's always mandatory to have an object. I'd like to think about it, I mean, this way.
All right.
And inside of that object, it's always mandatory to have a JSON property. And what is going to be sort of the value there? Of course, data. That is what we're sort of trying to achieve. So this is sort of the skeleton of the solution. And now, how do we grab 5 items, mungle them together, and like consolidate them into this data variable? So I would say like const data equals.
Okay.
Again, what are we interested in is the input that we have. So it would be items. And here is the interesting part. I would say you have these 5 items, right? So you want to iterate over all of these. So I would say dot map. Again, remember, map is just a fancy way of operating all of the items, just returning this array. And you're operating on each of the items. And what do we want to do? This was, if I remember correctly, the name and the URL, right?
Yeah.
So we would, let's take a look. We have terrible memory.
Yeah, the name
Name
and
and
URL.
URL, exactly. So let's say that the consolidated version would be, I mean, you tell me if you have another idea, but it would be sort of a string of, I don't know, like name, colon, and the actual name, and then URL, colon, the actual name, and that as a large string. So if you're good with that, I would say, for example, backtick, name, exactly. And then you can use monetary sign, and curly braces. And how do we access this, right? We have the item, right? But you have to remember, you cannot access name directly on the item because, again, n8n forces you to have the JSON property inside. So you do item.json dot the actual property that you have. Then you can step out of the curly brace and say URL. And it's the exact same
Similar
format, only, but with URL.
All right.
And maybe you can just stringify everything to keep it, instead of sending an array, you can just send this one long string, like toString.
Okay, toString. This is correct?
Exactly. So what is happening here? We have an input of items that, as we know, is, again, always remember, it's a bundle of items that have a JSON property that contains whatever you want. In this case, the name and a URL that correspond to a Pokemon. So what do we do over each item? We sort of access the property, which means we're grabbing the item itself. We grab the name inside of the item and just place it after the colon. We grab the URL, place it after the semicolon for the URL. And that, I mean, the whole map, of course, you have to remember, always returns a bundle. In this case, just to keep it clean, we stringify it. Because, I mean, usually when you're sort of like sending data as this one long message, maybe that's one of the solutions that you might reach for. And all of that, variables are not really storage devices, but if you want, you might think of it as a box. It's usually sort of a label or an arrow that's pointing to sort of this long consolidated string. And basically we're saying return one item that has a JSON property that points to that consolidated string. So again, 5 items coming in, 1 coming out. The JSON property has to be an object. So we are probably forgetting, if you can open it up again, right? The JSON property has to be an object. Yeah, because we're returning a string.
Right? Yeah.
You can just replace data. Yeah, open the braces there.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now it's an object pointing to that particular string.
Awesome. So this is gonna send me just now a single message for all of the Pokemons. Okay. One thing I want to add quickly is a new line. Not sure if it's gonna work, but let's see in the message. So if I get that expression and get it from the previous node. Okay, yeah, the new line works. Looks good. And if I execute it, it only executed once, and we just got the message once. Awesome.
So always a good idea.
Yep. All right. So we are running out of time. So Ivan, let's go back to the image and let's just quickly wrap up and summarize what we did today.
Right. Well, I mean, the whole point of this presentation was basically to try to convey to people how data travels from one end to the other of a workflow in n8n, how to transform the different pieces of data that you might have, you interact with different services, third-party services throughout the internet. And of course, you have very different, the shapes of the data you might get are very different. So the whole idea of this was to try to convey sort of what the target data structure is that you want to sort of go for when you're working with n8n, so that whatever you receive, you can sort of reach out inside of it, grab whatever you need, and transform it to something else. Usually the case is, you have an array of items that it's sort of buried inside of this big nested or data structure that you want to become n8n items, because you don't need to loop over them. You have n8n items. Whatever you do to them is gonna, whatever you do, you set one action and that is going to happen to 5 Pokemon, 100 users, the n items and operations.
Got it.
So we're trying to enable people to sort of see, and I totally agree that it might be confusing sometimes with the JSON view, not really showing the JSON property, what is actually going on inside the hood, so that when you actually need to do this work, this delicate work of reaching out inside of a data structure, so as to convert it to an n8n format, or the other way around, you already have an n8n items and you just want to consolidate. Maybe you're iterating over lots of data, but you just want one output email to tell you one simple message, which is the result of that calculation. You don't want 100 emails coming out of that, because that would be sort of overkill. They just want one of them. So again, you can reverse engineer your knowledge to return just one single item from whatever you have. So again, from a foreign shape to an n8n shape of multiple items to an n8n shape of one item, which consolidates all of those. And this you can achieve usually with a function node, with a function item node, with the set node if you're just setting key value pairs that not very in a not very complicated scenario. But yeah, this is, all of those are details. As long as you have a clear picture of sort of what the data should look like when it's inside of n8n, then you won't be surprised when n8n sees one item when you're seeing many, or the other way around.
All right. Thank you, Ivan, for such a wonderful explanation and joining us. Do we have any questions for Ivan before you hop off? Also, let me know what you all think of the live stream for today and what other topics you would like us to cover. Ivan, how do people reach out to you?
So my email at work is ivan@n8n.io. So yeah, I think that would be the easiest. Otherwise, you can post in the forums, and in between work projects, I usually try to answer things if Ricardo doesn't get to people first.
Yeah. I'm still trying to beat Ricardo on that and try to answer him first. I like try to answer first before him. Yeah. All right. I see message coming in from Chris. All clear. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you, Chris, for joining in, and thank you all for joining in. It was really wonderful to learn some JavaScript and understand how n8n processes the data. And once again, if you have any questions, feel free to hop on to our community forum and ask any questions that you might have. All right, everyone. Have a nice day. Bye.
Thank you. Have a nice evening, everyone.